This afternoon's illustrated talk, Hidden Alleyways of Washington, D.C., will be a treat for anyone with converging interests in local history, architectural history, social history, even economics. The evolution of the lowly alley in Washington, D.C. allows one to bring together all these vantage points to offer a unique perspective on the city's development itself. Kim's compelling exploration of the alley will reveal that these spaces have not always been what we think. I have the great pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Kim Williams, veteran architectural historian and widely recognized expert on the history of our community in Washington, D.C. and Chevy Chase. She's the co-author of what is still considered the defining book on the history of our community, Chevy Chase, a home suburb for the nation's capital. She's been writing about historic places and communities for more than 30 years. For 15 years, the past 15 years, she served as the National Register Coordinator at the DC Historic Preservation Office. Her primary activity there is researching, evaluating, and documenting properties for listing in the National Register. Kim is also a longtime friend of CCHS, having given several illustrated talks over the years. We're delighted that she's here with us again today to talk about her most recent book and the focus of this talk, Hidden Alleyways of Washington, D.C., A History. After her presentation, Kim will gladly take questions from our audience, and she will sign books. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kim Williams.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you all for coming out today to hear me talk about alleys and my recent book. Not that recent, it was came out about a year ago. But alleys are really exceptional, unique places in Washington. They're unlike any alleys of other American cities. They were places of habitation, they were places of commerce and industry, and then they were also refuges for the artistic community. So I'm going to touch on all of those aspects of alleys in today's lecture. But I just want to start a little bit about how I got to this point in writing a book.
Could you get a little closer to the microphone?
Yes, is that better? Okay, oh wow, sounds really loud to me. So yeah, just as Carolyn mentioned, I have been working for the past 15 years with the DC Historic Preservation Office, where I review designations to the National Register. So people come to us with applications to designate buildings. And then once they're designated either as landmarks or historic districts, we then evaluate the properties for any alterations or additions. Well, many of our historic districts are very old. They date from the 1970s, the 80s, and 90s. And at the time that they were designated, we did not go into the alleyways. So these districts have all of the buildings that face the public streets protected and designated. But there were a lot of pressures in the early 2000s on our alley buildings. There were builders who were coming in and doing rear additions, knocking down historic alley buildings. And we realized we had no information on them at all. And so I started a building by building, alley by alley survey. And over the course of 3 summers, I had summer interns and students and volunteers walking the alleys, collecting information on all of the alley buildings, especially those that were historic buildings, 50 years or older. And then we compiled a database so that we had an understanding of these buildings so that we could evaluate them for any alterations. But it was in the process of doing the survey that I came to understand and learn about the fascinating history of both the social and the physical history of DC's alleys. So after a couple of years, I decided to do a book. I was giving presentations to local communities about the alleys, and everybody's like, oh, you should write a book. So I finally decided to do it, and it was published by Georgetown University Press. So it's been a real pleasure working with the University Press on this project. So to start, actually, I want to tell you a little bit about the geographic confines of my study. So when I talk about alleyways of Washington, D.C., I'm not talking about the District of Columbia as we know it today. I'm talking about the original city of Washington that was established in 1790 as the federal city. And the city was laid out by the French engineer and architect, Peter L'Enfant. And this is the plan for the original city. And you can see, just to orient you a little bit, this edge of the city is essentially today's Florida Avenue. That is the northern edge of the city. And if you've ever driven down 13th Street or 16th Street, you may notice there's a very steep hill going down into the city. And Florida Avenue is kind of right at the bottom of that hill. This was the natural sort of edge of the city before this very steep escarpment, and so it formed the northern edge. The rest of the city was established by the eastern branch of the Potomac River, today's Anacostia River, and the Potomac River. So this is the city of Washington. District of Columbia is a much larger diamond-shaped area. So as it was laid out in 1791 by Peter L'Enfant, the plan, which you see here, included streets and avenues. It included the public reservations for the city, which we consider our squares and circles today, mostly with statuary on them. It did not include alleyways. However, we know that alleys were intended from the outset because George Washington prepared the first set of building guidelines and regulations for this new city. And his guidelines in 1791 read that passages into the squares may be arched or gated with permission from the DC commissioners. So the passages into the squares would have been those access points that led to the interior of the squares. That was in 1791. Between 1792 and 1796, city surveyors began to measure and plat our city squares. We call blocks in DC squares. So if I say squares, but the block isn't actually square, it's just a technical term. But so they measured and platted all of the city squares. And at that time, in that short 4-year period, all of the city squares, but except for in a few exceptional cases, had alleyways. These alleyways occupied the very large center of the square. These were, in general, very large squares, and the alleyways occupied the center. They generally, although they came in many configurations, the majority of them were I-shaped and H-shaped alleys. So you can see here, for instance, this is an I-shaped. This is more of an H-shaped here. Those alleys had access alleys leading to the center of the square. These access alleys were very narrow alleys, about 10 feet wide or 15 feet wide, whereas the alleys at the center of the city squares were about 30 feet wide. And those alleys allowed for horses and carriages and carts to turn around readily at the interior of the squares. So the city planners, and I also want to mention that because of the nature of the alleys being at the center and accessed by the very, very narrow access alleys, they were known from the start as hidden alleys or blind alleys. So you will see reference to these as hidden alleys or blind alleys. This is an example of one of the squares on today's Capitol Hill. And you can see that as configured, the city blocks were typically very, very wide, very, very deep. Sometimes they were 100 feet wide, sometimes 150 feet deep. And here is the narrow access alley that led to the wider alley at the back. It was anticipated by the early city planners that people would build detached houses on these large lots, and that the rear of the lots would be used for gardens, for ornamental or kitchen purposes. And that they might also have animals and goats back there. And they might also have outbuildings, sheds and privies and wells, as well as quarters for the enslaved. This is a drawing from 1852. It's actually a watercolor rendering by an architect whose name is General Montgomery Meigs. He's an architect and an engineer. He was responsible for actually the city's water system, bringing water from Great Falls in the Potomac River into Washington during the Civil War years. But he was also something of an amateur artist, And he drew this, or he made this watercolor rendering, which is incredible in that it is the only known image from this early that shows what the backyard view of houses downtown looked like. So this is a square between 12th and 13th and K and L streets downtown, and you can see the gentleman at the back of his house looking out over the backyard views, and you can get an understanding really of what the city looked like then with these alley buildings in the back, these gardens and fences separating the houses from one another. This is a smokehouse here, and the alleyways were there and were often separated by fences. So this is an incredible find to show what the alleys look like in the early period of the city's history. The city was very slow to develop, so that was its first 50 years of development. It was still a very small city at that point. But as you know, things do not always happen as planned, and as the city started to grow during the mid to late 19th century, the city's population was increasing. And so builders and real estate speculators and owners were looking for greater opportunities to develop housing in the city squares. So they started to divide these large, really wide lots. So the lots originally on the L'Enfant plan were like 100 feet wide. They started to divide them width-wise to create very narrow width lots, like 20 feet wide to 25 feet wide. And that change in the size of the lots has really given rise to the nature of our row house city today. If you go downtown, Capitol Hill, DuPont Circle, you see a lot of row houses. And so that was a way to increase the amount of housing on these large city blocks or large city lots. So this is where they've divided them just in terms of their width. But they didn't stop there, and this is where alleys come into play. They also divided these lots off at the back of their lots. So these these are called alley lots. So these lots were cut off at the back, creating these alley-only lots. So these were lots that had frontage only on the alleyways and not on the public streets. This was a way for real estate speculators, developers, and owners to really more than quadruple, turn eightfold their land into 8 developable lots. So on the front of these lots, the row houses would face the public street. And at the interior of the lots, there were groups of houses that would be built on these alley-only lots. So you can see here, for instance, these are all tiny little alley buildings here, alley dwellings here, alley dwellings here. The red color means that they were brick construction, and the yellow means that they were wood frame buildings. In addition to these alley dwellings that were built at the interior of the squares, there were also carriages and stables that were built at the backs of those longer lots that were not divided off. And so there was this sort of wall that was created at the backs of the public-facing lots and between the public-facing lots and the alley lots, creating these very insular communities. And you can see the slide on the right is a photograph from about 1915 of an alley in Southwest DC called Willow Tree Alley. And you can understand from this photograph how enclosed these alleys were and these alley communities. They were very insular, not visible from the exterior public right-of-way. So at first, before the Civil War, there were about 50 alleys in the city that housed about 350 people. The vast majority of those first residents of the alleyways were white immigrants, and it seems, based upon the archival evidence, that they were built by the owners of the houses who lived in the house in front of them and were hiring workers, and they built these alley dwellings at the rear of their lots and ultimately later divided the lots off. But by the time of the Civil War, right before and after the Civil War, when there was an influx of African Americans coming to the city for seeking freedom before the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, looking for jobs and stability. They came streaming across the river from Virginia. We had about 40,000 African Americans, newly freed, who moved to Washington in the years immediately after the Civil War. The city had no place to put them. I mean, we were very ill-equipped for this influx of residents. And so the alleys became the place where new houses were built for these incoming residents. They were built very quickly. They were built with found materials. Many of them were built by the enslaved themselves. Some of them were built by, we think, by charitable organizations. The Society of Friends, for one, is thought to have built some of these alley dwellings. We know very little about the alley dwellings from that period from any period writings, but there are a few newspaper articles, and most of them, those that do exist, describe these houses as mean cabins having dirt floors, walls of boards with holes, and roofs of tin, tar, felt, and rags. And an 1865 story noted that all sorts and sizes of them may be found, wedged in every conceivable shape into vacant spaces, yards, and alleys. By 1871, there were 1,500 people living in the alleyways. There was no plumbing in the alleys. There was no heat, no insulation in these houses, and no sewage systems. So there were water pumps in an alley to serve the entire alley, one outhouse for the alley in its entirety, and sometimes it was for two alleys together. So they had one water pump and one outhouse for two alleys that could have been serving dozens of households. This is a photograph from the turn of the century, 1904, of one of these Civil War era alley dwellings. None of these survive into the present, so these photographs are all that we have of those early dwellings. The social reformers were immediately kind of outraged by the conditions in the alleys. And already by 1871, there were housing reformers who wanted to make change. And they started lobbying the government, and they did so fairly successfully. So by the early 1870s, they had made a couple of changes. There were building regulations that were implemented for the first time. And those building regulations forbade wooden buildings to begin with, so none of those alley buildings could any longer be built of wood. They established minimum widths for houses. So the minimum width for a house was 12 feet wide. That was the narrowest you could build a house. And they required that each dwelling have either a toilet or an outhouse. So every house had to have its own toilet or outhouse. So while these laws improved the quality of construction of alley dwellings, they did not require any sewage hookups, and they did not require any indoor plumbing to be brought in from the street. And they didn't obviously require any heat. So the regulations did nothing to stymie the construction of new alley dwellings. There were hundreds of alley dwellings built in the 1870s and the 1880s until 1892, when a law forbade construction of any more alley dwellings. By the late 19th century, based upon a police census, we know that there were 18,978 people living in the alleys, and 93% of these were African American and very destitute and poor. So this is a typical plan of an alley dwelling. You can see it never was greater than 12 feet wide because that was the minimum required width. So they weren't going to go any wider than what was, the minimum requirement. They were generally 10 feet deep. They had two rooms, a front room and a rear room, and then there was a lean-to at the back that housed either a toilet and maybe a sink or a stove for cooking. And the lean-to would have just been a one-story shed roof frame addition to the two-story brick house. So you had the brick house was this, front room, back room, first floor, and then two rooms above. That became the standard alley dwelling, and you can see in this photograph here, They were built by the dozens in hundreds of alleys throughout the city. So despite the better construction and new building regulations, health codes were rarely enforced, and unsanitary and unhealthful conditions persisted in the alleyways. And from the late 19th century into the mid-20th century, black and white leaders alike condemned the city's alleys as slums and places of evil. But most of what we know about alley living comes from these progressive era reformers who were going into the alley, studying the alley life, and writing about it and proposing change or eradication of the alleys. There are a couple of really important reports, government funded reports, but then also some nonprofit groups that did these studies. And they're almost always filled with excruciating details on the squalor of the living conditions. And they were almost always illustrated with photographs showing the worst of those conditions. And some of those conditions you can see here. Overflowing privy that the owners didn't come to clean despite health code requiring them to do so. This is a kitchen in that little lean-to shed that I showed you in plan. And this is children in one of the alleys behind the Capitol Hill alleyway, just to show you the conditions of life there. On the other hand, an examination of the record reveals that others who were documenting the city's alleys had a different perspective on alley life. There was a minister of Shiloh Baptist Church whose name was Reverend Waldron, and he founded something called the Alley Improvement Association in 1904. And he recognized that alleys provided a home and a space for the city's poorest residents. And he really lobbied for the alley residents and advocated for them. He fought the city on its efforts at eradicating the alleyways and the alley dwellings, and instead really encouraged the city to bring in the infrastructure necessary to make these alleys healthful places to live. In the 1930s, there was a PhD student whose name was Daniel Sweeney, and he, as part of his dissertation, he interviewed a number of alley residents, and he concluded that the alley dwellers were deeply connected to their communities, and most of them had no desire to leave. And my book has a couple of those interviews, not in full, but just excerpts from those interviews, and they're really fascinating to read because the alley dwellers really, truly did feel a sense of community and found that they were more comfortable in the alleyways than when they got outside the alleyways. They didn't feel welcome in the community outside the alleys. And then there's a photographer named Godfrey Frankel who photographed the alleys and the minor streets of Southwest in the 1940s. And I'm just going to quote him because I find this quite moving. He said, "I was amazed when I first saw these alley houses, monotonous, drab, two-story brick houses stretching a block long and people spilling out of the doorways directly onto the street. But he soon discovered a specialness to the alleys and admitted, even though my initial motive was to reveal inadequate housing, poverty, and squalor, there was something else that I was seeing, and I attempted to capture it." And you can see from these two photographs of Godfrey Frankel's what that specialness was that he was trying to capture. Here's an alley with children playing. There's a real sense of people taking care of themselves in the alleys. And here is a church service that's taking place on a Sunday morning in the alley. And I love this picture, seeing the young girls dressed up in their white Sunday best in the midst of what others would call these squalid conditions. And I'm just going to show a couple more photographs here. These were all photographs taken by FSA photographers, Farm Security Administration photographers, in the 1940s, government effort to illustrate urban and rural conditions across the country. And so many of those photographers came to DC and photographed the alleys in DC. And I love this photograph because it does capture that sense of community that we've heard about. Here, apparently, is a truck that's coming to offload a bunch of empty boxes, and you can see some of them there. And all of the children are out to help unload those boxes, which they would use to feed their fires, to keep the houses warm. But what's particularly nice about this is you see the people with their heads, popping out the windows. It's like the alley was the front porch. The alley was the community center. This was, the center sort of square of their town. And here you see, this is a young child or two children there, and then here is a mother looking out after the activity. And again, this is another photograph taken by an FSA photographer. This one is a posed photograph, and it shows a family in the alleyway. And here, what's incredibly interesting from my perspective is how the parents have pulled the furniture into the alleyway itself. These houses were tiny. They were 12 feet wide, 10 feet deep. And so the alleys really did become the living rooms. And they were, immediately across the alley from another alley dwelling. And so it was really, literally like a living room. So I love this photograph for that reason. Then you can see also all of the children in the doorway peeking out at the photographer. Apparently, no matter how obscure the photographers tried to be to capture this alley life without, being too posed, the children apparently loved the photographers and always wanted to have their pictures taken. But life in the alleys was not limited to the residential, and my book has a couple of chapters on the industry and commercial aspects of our alleyways. So alley dwellers had to share this space with a lot of this industrial activity. And this is just an image of one of the alleys downtown. No longer exists. This is called Nails Alley. And it's incredible, and it shows all of the different activities taking place. This was it's actually off of 7th, just east of 7th Street. And 7th Street was a very important commercial corridor. It brought a lot of goods from Montgomery County. A lot, farm goods would come in via 7th Street and go all the way down to Center Market, which was at today's National Archives building. And so all along 7th Street was sort of a mercantile corridor. And right at Mount Vernon Square, where Mount Vernon Square is today, was a market that was called Northern Liberties Market. And this is the side of that public market space. And so the alleys around 7th Street corridor and the market were very much industrial and commercial in character. So this is one of the alleys you can see here. This is a row of dwellings. This is a refrigeration plant, and these are stables, warehouses, and workshops, and then garages here. So you can see people were living in the alleys, but not exclusively alone. In fact, they shared the alleys with horses and oxen. And I love this photograph. This is the oxen of Simpson's Dairy, which was a dairy plant, bottling plant that was down in Capitol Hill. And they housed their fleet, or whatever you call a collection of oxen are. There are many oxen in a herd, a herd of oxen in the alley. And the herd we'd be taken to Union Station in the morning to pick up the big vats of milk that had been sent down from the farms in Montgomery County. And then the oxen would bring those big vats of milk to the alley, where it was then bottled and distributed across the city. And at first it was distributed in horse-drawn carriages, such as you see here. This is Simpson's Dairy delivery wagon, and later there were trucks that delivered them across the city. There's a single building left in this alleyway associated with Simpson's bottling plant, and it's a 1925 garage. So it housed the fleet of cars and trucks that delivered the bottles across the city. But by far the biggest commercial venture in the alleyways was the livery stable. That's the commercial stable where people could go to hire out a horse or carriage or a driver, where they could have their own horse shod or their carriage repaired. And there were many of these livery stables across the city, and many dozens of them were in the city's alleyways. This one was one of the largest ones in the city. It's called the Tally Ho Stables. And the building still exists. It is today the DC Archives. It's on Naylor Court downtown. And just kind of imagine if you can hear the noises in your mind on any given day, it would have just been a bustle with activity as people were coming and going. They were renting horses and carriages and drivers by the hour, and horse handlers were there, bringing the horses in and out, watering them after they'd been out, and smithies who were shoeing the horses. So it was just an incredible beehive of activity in these alleys, and obviously people living next door as well. This is one of the surviving livery stables. This is called Proctor's Alley. It's on between 12th and 13th and M and N streets downtown. It's just recently been converted into multifamily housing. It's, I think, it's a condominium of sorts. And I'd like to point out here that you can tell where the horse stalls were by virtue of the stall windows. And interestingly, they often put the horse stalls above the carriage spaces below. First of all, it was a lot easier to get the carriages in the first floor, and they would have wooden ramps that the horses would walk up to the second floor. But they also put the horses on the second floor because according to a lot of the sort of periodicals of the time, the horses really were happier in the quiet. And so they didn't want a lot of noise over their heads. And obviously, the coming in and out of the carriages would have been very disruptive to them. Another reason for having the horses in the upper floors is for reasons of theft. So apparently, if you put the horses on the ground floor, there was a greater likelihood that they might be stolen. So if you're walking around and you see what looks like a carriage house and you see the stall windows up above, you'll know you're right. So as the horse and horse-drawn era came to an end and industry started to move further out beyond the center city, the former stables and warehouses were converted to garages or they were left vacant and abandoned altogether. There were restaurateurs, artists, and other creatives who were seeking affordable space, and so they moved into the alleyways and they adapted these obsolete buildings to new uses. In the 19-teens, in the 1920s, there were several artist communities that grew up in the alleys all the way from downtown to Georgetown. One of these was a venue called the Crazy Cat Club. It was in Greens Court downtown, and it was referred to at the time as a bohemian speakeasy. It was run by a local Washington artist who had gone to McKinley High School, and he was described as some lost pre-Raphaelite fallen by mistake into the Capitol. And the journalist who was describing this Crazy Cat Club also described what happened there. He said, "The place was as weird and crazy as its name. It was furnished with rustic handmade furniture, lit with candles, and warmed by a blazing open fire. And it featured a well-used dance floor and theatrical space." And he said, its real draw, however, was the garden, courtyard, and treehouse, which you can see at the right. This is the treehouse. It was a spreading tree with airy rookeries built in its branches, and it was reached by a 12-rung ladder. Waiters ferried drinks up the ladder to clubgoers seated at the treehouse's only table. So here you can see the waiter carrying this tray of drinks up the ladder to the customers at the treehouse. And the Crazy Cat Club, although they said, this was a crazy name, it was actually, I believe, named for Cleon Throckmorton's girlfriend, who he later married. Her name was Catherine Mullins, and she was an artist as well, and she went by the name Cat. So pretty sure the Crazy Cat Club was named for her. This is just a photograph of the building today. So you can see here, I'm just going to point out, this is this wide overhanging eave. These are the horse stall windows there, and these are the longer windows, which probably opened into the carriage room. And this is the building today. You can see here that wide overhanging eave, the horse stall windows here, and then the larger windows there. So just a little evidence of the still standing Crazy Cat Club.
Is that Northwest?
Yes, yeah, it's between 12th and 13th and M and N streets downtown. And yeah, it's middle of downtown, and it's not, that building stands, but it's otherwise not particularly quaint alley. But the Crazy Cat Club was not the only one of the city's artistic communities. There was another one that was called St. Matthew's Court, which still exists today. This is a current day photograph of the stables that were turned into artist studios in the 1930s. But it really became a major artistic hub, and it remained there for 3 decades. So artists lived in St. Matthew's Court. This is in DuPont Circle. It's just north of Rhode Island Avenue, just north of where St. Matthew's Cathedral is. So it's right behind St. Matthew's Cathedral. In 1934, a newspaper reporter who was exploring the city's alleyways described St. Matthew's Court as thus: "Here live painters and sculptors. In these studios, which were formerly stables, dwell artists, those gay devils supposed to have a peculiar genius for loose living and hell-raising in general. But while New York's Greenwich Village has free love and Paris's Latin Quarter has bacchanalian orgies, the capital's Bohemia has only decorum, peace, and a certain quaint, full-flavored beauty." And this is the interior of some of those artist studios at St. Matthew's Court. On the left is a sculptor whose name is George Julian Zolnay, and you can see him with a plaster cast at left, and this was actually a plaster mock-up for a group of World War I soldiers that were going to be built, or statues of World War I soldiers that were going to be built in Nashville in front of the Parthenon, the Nashville Parthenon, commemorating the centennial of the city and World War I memorial. And then on the right is an artist whose name was Edward Rowan, and he worked for the federal government in the art department, and he kept his studio in St. Matthew's Court. There were several other DC alleys that were devoted to sizable artistic communities before World War II, including this alley, which is in Georgetown. This is between O and P Streets and 33rd and 34th Street. This alley was dubbed Artists Alley, and it became home to a group of women artists. And they came in the 1950s, and they converted these former stables into studios and apartments where they both lived and worked. The leader of this group was a ceramicist whose name was Catherine Hobbs, and she spearheaded something that was called the Artists Mart in Georgetown, and it was a gallery dedicated to the work of local artists, and it existed up until the 1980s. So while entire communities of artists were moving into the alleys with no repercussions from city officials, housing reformers in the early 20th century really continued on a relentless effort to eradicate the longtime alley dwellers in the alleyways and eliminate the alley dwellings in the alleys themselves. There were several efforts to do so, but the biggest one came in 1934 when Congress passed something called the Alley Dwelling Act, and with that act, they created the Alley Dwelling Authority. And the Alley Dwelling Authority was given 10 years to eliminate all of the remaining alley dwellings in the city. At that point, there were still thousands of alley dwellings and probably about 220 alleys that still had alley dwellings in them. So they began their process. This was established in 1934, and this is from their 1935 annual report or 1936 annual report, and it shows some of their efforts. This is downtown, this is on Capitol Hill, Douglas Court Northeast. This is a historic image showing the alley dwellings. There were 12 alley dwellings in that Capitol Hill alley, and the Alley Dwelling Authority replaced the alley dwellings with this garage building, which still stands today. Just to sort of orient you, if you look, this wall is basically the same. It's not the same wall, but this is how you can see it. So this elevation here is here, this wall here is there, just to give you an idea. So this garage replaced 12 alley dwellings. In some cases, the Alley Dwelling Authority, the ADA, replaced alley dwellings with new sanitary houses, but for the most part, they just demolished them, replaced them with garages, and sort of left the residents to their own devices to find new housing. So what happened was after World War I began, the 10-year time limit, the termination of that 10-year period would have been 1944 for the act that was passed in 1934. But as housing became really necessary during the war, we had a shortage of housing as there were workers coming into the city. We really couldn't displace, we recognized we couldn't displace all the people living in alleys because there was no housing for them elsewhere. So there was a moratorium put on the Alley Dwelling Act, and so the authorities stopped demolishing the alleys, and the ban was to last another 10 years. It actually was extended for another year. So the new date for the completion of the elimination of the alleys was put at 1955. So the Alley Dwelling Authority really did very little between the late 30s and 55. But what did happen is that people started to recognize, these are young professionals who are moving into the city, and they were finding these quaint historic neighborhoods in Georgetown and Capitol Hill and downtown, and they started to renovate the historic houses, both those houses that faced the street, but then also they began to move into the alleys themselves. And they started to renovate the alleys. They brought in the infrastructure that didn't exist before. They brought in the plumbing and the electricity. They basically gutted these houses. They put kitchens in them, and in the process, obviously, displaced the owners. And then they turned around and sold these houses mostly to white professionals for a much higher price point. Or they were renting them for greater price point than the alley dwellers were paying. This is one of the first examples of that renovation effort. This is on Capitol Hill called Terrace Court, and it says private owners reclaiming neighborhood once known as Capitol Hill slum. This is a before picture, and this is a picture of the houses being renovated. This is a picture of the houses today. Most of which each one probably sells for more than $1 million. This is an example of one in Georgetown, and this one is sort of particularly sad story in that there were 36 residents of this alley. It was called Bell's Court, and when the owners and builders moved in to start to renovate the houses, it was all really because the street residents at that point were really complaining to the police about noise and certain behaviors in the alleys, and so the police came in and condemned the alleyway. And so after its condemnation, basically these eager entrepreneurial builders then made an offer to the owner who had owned the alley and the alley dwellings for many years and been collecting rent for many years, and offered a price to buy them. And so because the alley dwellings were condemned, the residents were already moved out, and the buyer moved in, renovated all of the dwellings, and then he sold them each individually, again, to white professionals. But the interesting thing here, too, is that they knew that alleys had a really negative connotation. And so many times when these alleys were renovated, they changed the name as well. And so Bell's Court had always had a really negative connotation because there had been a lot of crime and other activities there that had been reported in the press. And so they totally changed the name and called it Pomander's Walk. So you see here, the headline here is Condemned Slum in Georgetown Goes High-Hat as Pomander Walk. So then what happened was in 1953, 2 years before the termination date for the Alley Dwelling Authority to demolish all of the city's alleys came up, the city started to prepare the owners of these alley dwellings that had just been renovated and told them you need to vacate your houses. They're all going to be condemned in in 2 years' time, so you need to get out of the houses. Well, of course, all those people who had just paid a lot of money for those houses and spent time and effort renovating them, just sort of banded together and started lobbying the government. And they got their organization, their neighborhood association together and basically said, we have really completed what the mission of the Alley Dwelling Authority by cleaning up these houses and bringing in the electricity and the plumbing. And so we really don't feel like they should be demolished. And of course, they won. And the Alley Dwelling Act was never, it was abandoned, annulled. And so the act was never carried through. And so there were, of the thousands of dwellings that were supposed to be demolished, there still remain a couple hundred. And those were identified during the survey that I told you about. This is just a photograph of some of the alleys. This is in Georgetown. This one, actually, not sure. This one is Capitol Hill on the left and then Georgetown on the right. And some of our alleyways today, which are actually being sort of, there are buildings that are being renovated. There are cafes and bookstores and shops and restaurants in some of the downtown alleys, particularly Blagden Alley, Naylor Court, if you've ever been down there. Katie's Alley in Georgetown are all alleys that have been renovated in recent years. In some cases, like in Blagden Alley, which you can see at the left, private individuals and nonprofits like the DC Alley Museum are helping to highlight the city's alley history through renovation and art. And this apparently here, this love sign, this was a row of alley dwellings. The first floor was converted to garages in the 1930s or 40s. And these roll-up doors have been painted by local artists with this love sign, which is apparently the most Instagrammable site in Washington, D.C. But then there are other individuals like the owner, the owner of this stable who sort of resurrected this ghost sign that was, advertising the commercial stables there. He's repainted that. And so through some of these efforts, through nonprofit organizations and individuals, some of the history of these alleys are coming to light. For the most part, however, people know very little about the history of the alleys. This is Katie's Alley on the left, and if you've ever been to Katie's Alley, it's sort of home to high-end boutiques and designer showrooms, and there's little evidence of the fact that this was home to 12 indigent African-American families throughout the decades. So part of my goal in this book was to sort of just bring that history to light, so as we're all exploring the city's alleys, we know a little bit more about both their social and their physical history. So hopefully you'll get a chance to see more pictures in my book and enjoy a little bit more history in reading it. Thank you very much. And happy to take questions too. Yes?
The picture that you showed of that brick building that had the stables on the second floor, it looked as though there were regular apartment-type windows above it.
Yes. So those would have, so generally speaking, in these larger stable buildings, there would have been carriages on the first floor, horses on the second floor, and then the horsemen, the hostlers' rooms on the third floor, and often sometimes even tack rooms to store the horse tackle. And they're apartments now. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I was just impressed by the sort of potentially infectious public health conditions with people living without plumbing, without heat, no running water, and then you had animals on top of it. I would have imagined too that might have been sort of an area where you would have, outbreaks of certain diseases. So was the public health department involved in the reform at all, or was it just progressive people who thought that, there needed to be an upgrade?
Yeah. Good question. This is a question about the public health in the alleys, and obviously that, with the animals living there and people next to one another was clearly a problem for public health. And yes, that was actually one of the biggest reasons that social reformers wanted to eradicate the alley dwellings. And they were well-intentioned. They were the people were dying, obviously, people were getting sick, and the ratio of deaths to those living in the alleys versus those living in the public streets at the time were shown to be much higher, and the rate of disease and infection in alley dwellers was shown to be much higher than in the public streets. There's been some research done recently that doesn't support that finding, that if you're looking at similar type housing on the streets and comparing it to the alleys, those percentages are sort of similar. But obviously there's higher income housing on the streets, and so it was not comparable. But that was the big reason. Yes, it was a public health concern. And that's what a lot of the nonprofits were trying to do to get government investment in the eradication of alleys. They were bringing senators and congressmen into the alleys to show them this isn't just a problem for the people who live here, this is a problem for the greater public health. And one of the things, most of the people who lived in alleys had labor type jobs. I mean, the men literally were like hod carriers or brick carriers. The women actually had more stable work. They were domestics and they were laundresses. And one of the things they did is they did their laundry. They did the laundry for hotels and restaurants and individuals in the alleyway, and they hung the sheets and other laundry out to dry in the alleyways. And so one of the things that these social reformers did was bring the congressmen and senators and other politicians into the alleyways and saying, look, this is where your laundry is being dried. We're all, susceptible to disease and death because of these alleys. And so that was really what prompted a number of these congressional acts to eradicate the alleys. There was one in 1916, but it kind of fell short. And then really ultimately the 1934 one was based on public health. Yes?
It seems that alleys are prevalent throughout the district. The residential areas all have alleys, which didn't spawn alley buildings. And alleys don't exist in Maryland, or many, well, at least Bethesda.
Yeah.
Is there something peculiar about alleys and the district? Was it a requirement to have access to the back of houses? And then not to build anymore there?
Yeah, so the District of Columbia has sort of two different types of alleys, as I was saying. In the original city, those alleys were these blind alleys or hidden alleys. Beyond the original city, the alleys cut through the city blocks from one side to the other. They were literally just service alleys. They were alleys to service the garages at the backs of the houses, trash pickup, and things like that. I don't know if in Montgomery County, the suburban neighborhoods had, greater opportunity for these services to take place in the front. The lots are bigger, and I don't know from a city planning perspective why they wouldn't have had as many alleys in Maryland, but in DC, you could not build an alley dwelling after 1892. And so the nature of the alleys that were constructed outside of the original city changed to become just service alleys to cut through those alleys. And also, the L'Enfant Plan alleys were built because the squares were so big. I mean, they were really big city blocks, and the lots were really big, and so it helped to get access to the backs of the lots. But I don't know about why Maryland doesn't have alleys. I know that the traditional town planners, like up in Kentlands, brought alleys back for the reasons of being able to park off the street, get your services off the street, and things like that. So, but there were zoning regulations, I think, that discouraged alleys in the 20th century. Let's see. I'll go on this side over here.
It seems like most of the residents of the alley dwellings were black, and probably most of the street-facing properties were, the residents were probably white. So that means there was natural integration in those neighborhoods in terms of proximity, although separate school systems. How much of the impetus behind getting rid of alley dwellings was really not so much health or anything, but essentially a way of segregating Washington in a way that it hadn't been before?
No, I think there's absolute truth to that. I mean, it was a segregated city, and There was, it was sort of racism involved in terms of eliminating the alleys because they wanted to move the black population elsewhere. It isn't true that all of the street-facing houses were white occupied or owned. There were quite a few, not more than quite a few, there were hundreds and hundreds of black occupants on the houses facing the streets as well. They did tend to be in pockets of segregated areas, and then obviously racial restrictions came in really in force in the 1920s and 30s that absolutely limited where blacks could live versus whites, so it became even more segregated. But I do believe that a lot of these reports are using, the health issues of disease and death as a reason to eliminate blacks and displace blacks from the city. And, they just didn't want, it wasn't said straight out, but they did not, they wanted to get rid of a certain element of the population from these downtown neighborhoods. Yes, in the back.
Is there any documentation where the displaced families went because they lost their communities? Were they able to recreate it somewhere else in another neighborhood? Or
Yeah,
was it just lost?
So the question is there any evidence where these displaced residents went? And I did not do any systematic research on that, but a couple of the newspaper articles, the journalists at that time did do some investigation. And so, for instance, that one article that I showed you where Georgetown Alley goes high-hat as Pomander Walk, they absolutely said where each of the individuals ended up. And of course, at the time that they were living in Bell's Court, they were paying like $12 a month in rent. And in order to find new housing, many of them were living in much more squalid conditions at the same price, or they were paying 3 times that amount at $30 a month. At that point, there was public housing that was starting to be built in DC. So many people who were displaced did move into public housing. And so they had running water and electricity and heat in this new public housing, but they were removed from their communities. And so, they had gone to church in their neighborhoods in Georgetown and DuPont Circle and downtown. Their children went to schools there. And so when they had to go all the way out to far northeast and far southeast where the public housing was being built on cheaper land, they did lose their community. So yes, it was sort of hailed as a big success in many respects that, wow, these people were now living in sanitary housing, but they were living in sanitary housing that was very far removed from their communities and also not accessible to them because there was not adequate public transportation. And as we all know, then there was neglect in the public housing as well, and so conditions started to deteriorate there. So it's all kind of a vicious circle. Yes?
Is there any evidence of the earliest dwellers of these alleys were really slaves and they were slave quarters and then evolved? No?
No. So there is no actual evidence that, there probably were some early owners of houses who built enslaved quarters at the rear of their dwellings. There are some enslaved quarters that still exist in DC, but they weren't necessarily those that were subdivided from the back lot, subdivided off of the lots of the houses that went back to the alleys. These were more on, larger sites like Decatur House, for instance, the carriage house at the back of Decatur House down on Jackson Place across from, or right near the White House. Those were enslaved quarters. There's a house on Capitol Hill where the enslaved quarters were also in the carriage house. Most of the domestic enslaved lived in the houses of their owners in DC. But there very well could have been, but there's not extensive evidence for them having been built as enslaved quarters. Any other questions? Oh, yes, right here.
The photograph you have there, this boy gang,
Yeah.
it looks like they're mostly white.
Yes.
Or all white, and just, so I'm assuming there were a variety of races living in the alleys. It was really just about being poor.
Yes, that is true. But so the question is, the questioner was noticing that the boy gang at the photograph on the right is all white boys, and that is true. This was Cecil Alley, which was a white alley. For the most part, the alleys were segregated by race, but not through any imposed government, restrictions. It was just by nature. There were some alleys that were integrated, but there were 93% of the alley dwellings were black, so black occupied. So even though there were whites living in the alleys, 93% of them were black occupied. And Cecil Alley is right next to Katie's Alley, and I don't have a historic photograph of Katie's Alley, so I put that one there, but I also love the photograph because it's the boy gang. But if you're ever down on Water Street, K Street, and Georgetown, if you look up, you can see Cecil's Alley from K Street. You see that hill, and it's now brick, but it's cobblestone in the photograph. And yeah, very much looks like that. The houses still stand.
Does that
Yes.
street have a name?
Yeah, it's called Cecil Alley. Yeah. All right, thank you all very much.